Thank you, Joseph, and I want to thank the organizers for having me invited to speak here. It was mentioned this morning, I forgot. Maybe the speakers may want to change their title, since we were at some moment given a few days to give a title, and I would probably be one of those who would accept that offer. My official title is Illiberal Populism's Challenge to Constitutional Justice. And what I'm really going to speak about is the concept of constitutional justice, not only in terms of illiberal populism, but in terms of liberal constitutional democracy. And it seems to me that that will give a critical framework of both. But let me start with the dichotomy. The idea of illiberal populism as opposed to constitutional liberal democracy. Now, there was I think, a healthy reluctance in some of the previous speakers to define populism. So I'm just going to give you some notions because it's a complex and contested term. One of the, and then speak about illiberal populism. One of the characteristics of populism is that it speaks in name of the people, but it is never the people. It's always part of the people. And it speaks in terms of some specific interests or set of interests that are then projected as the interests of the polity as a whole. The illiberal version of this is that it's against liberal democracy, which is understood and has been mentioned already as the reign of the experts, the powerful, the use of courts and administrative structures, and all the institutions that have allowed us to reach the point where we are, complicated by the fact that now we have gone transnational, more in Europe perhaps than where I come from. But nonetheless, all these problems are now encapsulated in this world of being ruled by people far away, being ruled by experts whom we don't trust because they are not dealing with our interests, but rather the interests of a few. So in this context of this dichotomy, one thing that I'm going to leave out, because I think it raises interesting questions, and there's a debate about that, is leftist populism. The same as this right-wing, identity-based, illiberal populism. And there's a debate about that, and I will simply leave out the question of leftist populism that seems to want to engage in what I would say is a form of justice for those who feel that they are left out by the current system. But let's focus on the illiberal type of populism. Now, because I'm going to talk about constitutional justice, I'm going to artificially, because that also is a very complex issue that I don't have the time or, at this point, full analysis to address, of is illiberal populist democracy in and of itself incapable of having a constitutional type of system and life. And arguably it is, but I will take one example of somebody who has used the Constitution from a liberal point of view. He used the Constitution and constitutional tools to turn the Constitution against itself, but he argues, and some people argue with him, that it's possible to have an illiberal populist constitution. And so let me very generally summarize what does a constitution require. These are obvious things, but it'll give us a point of reference. A constitution requires some limitation in the form of government, some adherence to the rule of law, some collection of protection of fundamental rights, and some guarantees of democracy. And to take the example of Viktor Orban, he would argue that all these things he does in his system. First of all, he used the constitution after winning a large majority to get a new constitution for Hungary. After his election in 2010, he got a new constitution for Hungary in 2012. Then through amendments to the constitution, through the usual procedures, he weakened the courts, he weakened the independent media, etc., etc. Now, his basic argument is that, in effect, the difference between a liberal constitutional democracy and his version of illiberal constitutional democracy is a Kulturkampf, whereas the liberal constitutional democracy, in his views, promotes individualism, selfishness, capitalism, and lack of values. He focuses on the family, Christianity, and general communal living. But he says, so where are the checks on this? And he's against checks and balances because that's the typical language of the liberal constitution. So where does the constitutional come into his system? As a footnote, his own actions since he made the speech seem to belie the idea that he is very attached to constitutionalism. I just read in the press, as an aside, a couple of days ago, that he's going against a theater in Budapest, which is a rather apparently free form of art with criticism, but now he's upset that Budapest has an anti-Orban mayor, and as a result of that, he has found a way to try to intimidate the Hungarian theater. At least that's the American press version of what's happening now in Budapest. But anyhow, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, or more importantly, as a theoretical matter, imagine that one can run a illiberal constitutional democracy. So where are the checks and balances? The main instrument in such a populist constitutional illiberal democracy is that there are elections. And Orban himself points out that he has been re-elected in 2014 and 2018, but since it's a democracy, the people can decide to elect the opposition. And against the recent elections that are not on the national level, but on municipal level, prove that that check or that limitation of the power of government does exist. There is a rule of law, and he's very careful to say that every transformation, every amendment to the Constitution is at least procedurally in accord with the law. And then there is protection of rights, but he has a different view of rights than the liberal view of rights. The rights of the family, his version of religious freedom and sustaining those values. It's a slightly different packaging, but there is a bundle of rights. And of course, democracy is thriving in the sense that elections continue. So, given that, then I pose the question, how can we judge both how the liberal democracy, which is liberal constitutional democracy that's come under so much criticism, can be assessed, and how can we assess, to what extent can we reject, to the extent that we disagree with this, illiberal constitutional democracy. And in order to do that, I have come up with the idea of constitutional justice. And let me be clear what I mean by that, because some people may think, since we have French-speaking people here, is that it's a bad translation from the French. Justice constitutionnelle in France means just judicial review, whereas what I have in mind is sort of an adaptation of Rawls's idea of a theory of justice. So the thesis is as follows, that all liberal, at least liberal constitutions, but the idea of constitutionalism as it emerges, modern constitutionalism as it emerges in the 18th century, in effect deals with justice, although it's not always necessarily put in those terms. And I will focus, although it's more complex in reality, I will focus on only one aspect of justice that's crucial to my presentation, which is the idea of distributive justice. Now, this is where I take Rawls as an example and then turn it for my purposes. Rawls has an idea in his theory of justice that there are constitutional essentials. And his idea of constitutional essentials in his theory of justice is that you need a minimum of constitutional rule in order to achieve his view of a fair and just society. Now, the constitutional essentials for Rawls consist of two main principles. And those are, on the one hand, the first one allows for a lot of variation, the second one, very little. The first one is you need some form of democratic vehicle. It could be a parliament, presidential, and anything in between. So all bundle of those would work. And the second one, which is linked to his own theory of justice, is the idea of equal liberty, meaning a bundle of fundamental rights that over which there can be very little variation, and that is much more set in stone than the first principle. My idea of the idea that I do in terms of constitution is, I don't call it the constitutional essentials of a theory of justice, but the justice essentials of a constitutional order. And the justice essentials has also two principles, one of which is flexible, and the other one is not. And I will, in order to understand the flexible, let me simply go back to, and again, this is very theoretical, but go back to the two models that started what I call different models of constitutional identity. All constitutions have to somehow assemble an order that mediates between, on the one hand, what I call the ethnos, and you can define that however you wish, and on the other hand, the demos, about which we had conversations. And so I take as the example of the model of the ethnos, the German idea that there is a pre-political existing group, cultural, racial, whatever you want to call it, ethnic, etc., and that the constitutional order is there in order to allow this group to self-realize in the political arena. The other extreme is the French model of the French Revolution, which is focused on the demos. And if you look carefully at the 1789 Declaration and of the rights of man and citizen, it's interesting, it doesn't say of the Frenchman and French citizen, and although it leaves women aside, but for this purpose I'll not emphasize that. And so in theory, at least, the French model could work for a city like Geneva, which was Rousseau's idea, a country like France, or the world. The question of there is no definition in the model of who is to be associated in the constitutional unit. Now, of course, that leads to the metaphor of the social contract. But who is contracting in a social contract? So in order to have, in the modern world, which is pluralistic, and in almost any nation state, you have a plurality of interests, etc., in order to have a working constitutional order, you need to have some mediation between an ethnocentric and a democentric idea. And therefore, the models that you can have vary. The real German model no longer prevails. The real French model, or the original French model, as I put it, no longer prevails, but we have a whole spectrum in between. So that's one side of the equation. The second side of the equation is that in terms of justice, there has to be some, in terms of distributive justice, there is this side, which is the identity side, ethno side, and on the other hand, the material side or social welfare side. And so my idea of distributive justice in a constitutional setting is the Constitution has to address both of those. So if you leave out, for instance, important minorities in a system, you have a distributive injustice in terms of not enabling certain groups. On the other hand, if you have extreme conditions of poverty, then the system itself doesn't work either. Now, in the 18th century constitutions, you won't find very much in terms of social welfare rights. You have more of those in 20th century in more recent constitutions. But what I call the justice essentials is the minimum that a constitution has to guarantee, both in terms of distributive fairness among different, what I would call, generally speaking, ethnic groups, but it can be linguistic groups, et cetera, and on the other hand, the minimum in terms of social welfare. Now, of course, if one has a libertarian point of view, all you need is formal rights. If you have a more vigorous social welfare view, then you need more. So what are the two principles? The first principle is that of the minimum, what I call justice essentials of the Constitution, is that there be a working entente and also a fair treatment of the various plural groups within society. And the other one is, of course, the minimum level of justice on the material level. And then we can argue what those are, but that would be setting the floor of what is a minimum that is constitutionally guaranteed, and then the rest can be dealt with from a ordinary politics point of view. Now, the second one of these two principles can be viewed more generally, and the first one more generally encapsulated in what I call the dichotomy between the universal, the plural, and the singular. Modern constitutions have to give recognition and rights to the individual. The individual apparently during medieval times did not really exist. One could not be separated from one's social function, whereas now today, at least as a legal person, as a citizen, the individual counts, and each individual has to be considered singular. Then plural in the sense that all of our societies and all of the countries that we know that are constitutional democracies are not mono-ethnic, but have minorities, have different people with different ideologies, different religions, and so forth. And then by universal, I mean, and here I'm agnostic between these two conceptions, the two conceptions. What is that there are certain truths that apply to all societies, and some Kantian overlay, if you wish, over what is good for all of us. And the other one, which is the one that I am perfectly comfortable with, is the idea that every society has to find what I call a community of community. What is it that on which we can agree? What is the basis for this unit to function? Okay, so let me go from there, since I see that my time is short now, to my critiques, first of the Orban type illiberal constitutional democracy. Clearly, it fails on the first principle of what I call justice essentials of the Constitution, in the sense that it takes a part for the whole. And all of illiberal populism does that. It can do that ideologically, it can do that in ethno-national terms. And it's interesting that Orban's constitution goes from the constitution of the previous constitution was the constitution of the people of Hungary, and his constitution is the constitution of Hungarian nationals. So those who are not Hungarian nationals are immediately excluded. So all of these forms of right-wing illiberal populism seem to fail the first of the two principles of the justice essentials that I have articulated. And then the question becomes, what happens to why do we have a crisis of liberal constitutional democracies? And here we have all kinds of new developments that have been mentioned to some extent in previous presentations here, where there's a tremendous dislocation. Now, one of them, and it was presented in Professor Moisi's presentation, was the change from, if I understood correctly, from 40-1 to 600-1 from the richest to the poorest within society. That is a very obvious distributive justice problem for the liberal democracies today. And the other one is globalization, mass immigration. There seems to be a complete unknowing escape from what the framework that worked or seemed to have worked before has occurred. Now, what I can't give you, but I opened this up as a way to look at this and perhaps look at solutions. Can we recover liberal constitutional democracy? The answer is, if my formula is correct, yes, if we find an equilibrium between the right, what I call ethno-identity-centered side of it, and yes, if we find what has to be a much more elaborate social welfare construction. Obviously, since we exist in a transnational world in which many things can escape, a business can escape a country, can make its own law, or choose the Cayman Islands where the law is much more favorable to its business, not to respect labor standards by exporting jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So at some level, we have to find a way to arrive at a constitutionalization of the transnational order, which is very problematic. On the other hand, we have to perhaps have a much more vigorous constitutionalization of social welfare minimums, and we have to find a way to live together many, many more groups in at least a way in which we have different layers of constitutional order. Thank you very much.